Come on in, everybody. Hello, hello. Come on in, everybody. Get settled, get comfortable. If you were expecting to see Megan Torrance, you are in the right place. Um, I'm Jamie Washington, filling in for her today. If you participated in a previous xAPI cohort or xAPI party, you might remember me from behind the scenes. I'm joining you here today on the stage, which is a little different for me, but I think with a little teamwork, we can have a really great session. Uh, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is Spring 2022 xAPI Learning Cohort Week 2. This session is going to be recorded as always. And if you would like to be notified when that recording is available, make sure that you're signed up at xapicohort.com. Registration there is free. It just lets us know that you want to be notified with updates, links to recordings, slide decks, bonus goodies, things like that. So, all right. So let's jump in and see where we are at. Like I mentioned, this is week 2 of 12. And right now we have 722 people registered for this semester, which is really exciting. There are over 4,000 people actually in the alum group, but we don't automatically sign people up each semester. So it's really exciting to see familiar names and faces showing up from semester to semester. And it's also equally exciting to see all these new faces. And so I'm really curious. I like seeing people are dropping where they're learning from today. So let us know in the chat. And also, we're going to put out a poll. We're really curious to know, is this your first cohort or have you been around for a while? Maybe you're a seasoned cohort veteran. So if you want to drop your vote in there, we'd love to see. Because I know I've seen some names I definitely recognize, and but lots of new faces, which is really, really great. This is awesome. And as you know, we always say it's never too late to join cohort. So this is week 2. If you're just joining us today for the first time, you're not too late. You can catch up on what happened in week 1. The replay is available on demand. And also, if you know somebody who you think would benefit from participating, go ahead and invite them. They can join at any time. Registration will be open for the entirety of the semester. And so this week, we're going to talk about how to send xAPI data from e-learning. And we have Rebecca Davenport from Nebraska Med and Jeff Batt from the Learning Dojo and the Learning Guild here. And we're going to get to them in just a minute. So for our team, we typically have Megan Torrance here hosting. But like I mentioned earlier, I'm Jamie Washington, and I'm filling in for her today. And so we have Liz Barron here. She's on stage with me. You may have recognized her if you attended the most recent xAPI party, but she is going to be filling in as producer today. So she's behind the scenes, ready to help you with anything you need. And then we also have Matt Cleaver from our team joining us today, and he's going to come on a little later and help give us some good advice for some team traction. If you aren't already, you might like to follow the xAPI Gnome on Twitter. There's the handle there on the screen. And the Gnome likes to share out updates, resources, reminders, things like that. And also, if you want to talk about today's session or any of the sessions or any of your project work, if you use the hashtags xAPI and xAPI cohort, the Gnome likes to amplify those posts. So with that, let's do a little refresher for those new folks. We want to get you all up to speed on what is the xAPI cohort. And you probably have a little idea since you're here, but just as a reminder, the xAPI Learning Cohort is a free, virtual, vendor-neutral, 12-week learning by doing, project-based team learning experience and community. That's a mouthful. But basically, we run this 2 times a year, 12 weeks each. It's totally free, totally online, and it's a learning by doing experience where you get to work on projects with teams, and it really truly is a community. And so the cohort really happens in 2 places. The first is the weekly web sessions. That's where we are right now, whether you're tuning in live or catching the replay. The weekly web sessions are Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And like I mentioned, they are recorded, so you are able to catch up on those or just watch them again for more details. The other place that Cohort happens is in project teams, and that work really happens in Slack and GitHub. Although GitHub is optional, but Slack is really where your teams are going to form. You're going to communicate, make your plans for meeting, and the schedule for that really depends on your team project and your time commitment. So, Zara, if you are registered, you will automatically get the link to the recording sent to you. And actually, that segues perfect into this last bullet on this slide. Is we do send a weekly email update with the link to the session recordings and additional resources, bonus content, and the upcoming schedule. So if you make sure you're registered there, we can keep in touch. And we'll just put the link there too for you in the chat. So let's take a look at the schedule. We did have a couple of the surprises of last week got finalized for this week. But just to give a recap, the first few weeks of Cohort is really about xAPI. What is it? I know how to spell it, but how do I do it? So last week we had an introduction to what is xAPI, what is xAPI Cohort. Today we're going to talk about how to send data from e-learning, and next week we're going to talk about how to send data from something that's not e-learning. So that's what's happening in the weekly sessions. Now, over in the project team, this is when you want to be generating ideas, putting out feelers in the Slack channel, see if anybody's interested in something similar. Look for existing teams that you might want to join, start new teams. And I'm excited to say that we have seen a lot of that activity already happening in Slack. So then in the next part, we're going to look at building and tuning the ecosystem. We're going to look at how to use xAPI profiles, how to choose an LRS and make the most of it, learning analytics and designing for data, resources for planning, and data ethics. And in the project team world, that's when you're going to really start designing, building, getting help, getting feedback, testing, and repeating. And then we're going to start seeing it in action. We've got some great case studies and project team demos, which is actually where you get a chance to come on the live web session and present what your team has been working on this semester. And then, of course, we have the xAPI party, which is really the capstone to the xAPI cohort. So stay tuned for details on that later in the semester. Now, how you engage in Cohort is entirely up to you, but there's really 3 modes you could go into. Project mode is the most involved way to get the most engaged and involved way, where you're really working on a project, you're contributing to the Slack conversations, you're meeting up with your teammates, you're helping to do the work. It's very hands-on. And this could be your own project, or it could be someone else's project. Maybe somebody had an idea, but they're not able to do the work, or maybe you found a project from a previous semester that you want to continue. You could also be in observer mode, where you're not actively working on a project, but you're still involved in the Slack. You're reading through the conversations, maybe chiming in with some insights or input. And I just want to remind you that joining a team channel does not commit you to anything. And I know that most, if not all teams, totally welcome observers to come join their channels. You might get a little bit of encouragement to jump in if you join, but there's really no pressure. And it's kind of a nice way to get a little more in-depth information on the topics that you're interested in. The final way is just by listening in. You could join the weekly web session, which you're doing right now, either live here in AirMeet or in the recording. And that's really a no commitment way to just be in the know, catch up on what's interesting, see what other people are working on and doing. So we're glad you're here. Now, when you need help, when you have questions, we want to make sure it's really easy for you to get the help that you need. So if you have questions about xAPI, statements, LRSs, software, hardware, things like that, utilize the biggest resource we have here in Cohort, which is the people. There are over 4,000 people in that Slack channel from all around the world with brilliant minds, and you can post in the main channel for your general questions, or you can find a channel that maybe relates more specifically to the question that you have. If you have questions about the cohort in general, maybe you're not getting your emails, you don't remember the dates, you need help with GitHub or reporting an issue, That's where you're going to want to message our team directly. You can either find us in the chat or you can find us in Slack. And you can also email xAPI cohort at torrancelearning.com, and that will come to the full team and we'll be able to get you the help you need. Now, with that out of the way, I would like to bring Rebecca and Jeff to the stage and turn the mic over to them so that they can get into this session on how to send xAPI data from e-learning.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. I'll go ahead and start, and then Rebecca can take it from there. So my name is Jeff Batt. I am with the Learning Guild. I am the program manager over DevLearn. I also post a lot of training and tutorials through my own website, learningdojo.ninja. Been teaching on xAPI for years. So I'm happy to share a couple things about just sending xAPI statements in general to from learning authoring tools. And so I'm going to talk mostly about Storyline today, but I'll talk a little bit, or I'll show you a little bit about Captivate as well. And I mean, there's plenty of other tools out there that can send xAPI statements. But before I do that, I want to just cover a couple things about xAPI statements in general. I know that Megan quickly covered some of that last week as well, but I wanted to dive in really understanding what the xAPI statements are, because that is key. And when you start to send over these statements in either Storyline or Captivate as well. So when you're creating a learning experience and you want to be able to track the activity inside of the learning experience, so some type of event. So the learner clicked on a button, they liked something, they downloaded something. That's an event, and that event gets stored inside of what's called the Learning Record Store, or an LRS for short. So you can keep track of what they did. Did they like it? Did they download it? Did they visit a page? Did they exit a page? How much time did they spend in the page? Those are the types of events that you'll keep track of and you'll store inside of this learning record store. Now, that event is basically the statements, and that statement consists of three different parts. It consists of the actor, who the person is, it consists of the verb, what action did they do inside of the e-learning course, and then the object, which you describe the action. So to break it down, the actor, in this case, it could be me. The verb, what did I do? And there's different types of standard verbs like you get with SCORM as well, like completed. But you also have things like answered, you have things like read, you have things like liked, and everything like that. So that's the action. So you're not really describing what the action is at this point. That's really where the object comes into play itself. Now you can get verbs. This is one resource right now, the registry.tincanapi.com. I don't know if somebody wants to post that inside of the chats, but we can come back to that as well, or I can post it later. And then also a different ADL registry as well, which I can share. And that's where you can get the verbs and what verbs are actually out there for you to be able to track. And so once you have that verb, like for example, now downloaded, you then describe what that is. So in this case, it could be the help guide on ethics. The person downloaded it. If you want to provide more context, like if the verb was answered, what did they answer? What was their results? Things like that. That's where you can go ahead and you can describe quiz data. You can describe time spent and everything like that. So that's really the basics of these events. You're sending over these statements with who the person is, the verb, and the object. So if you understand that, at least when you start to build these statements inside of the e-learning tools, you're basically structuring it like that. So when you start to build it over all these different events, you can start sending them over at different points. Like Jeff Batt started a new goal. Jeff Batt completed a goal. And then you can even pull the data, and I'm sure they'll cover this later on, but you can pull the data from the Learning Record Store as well. That's one thing that I was having a conversation yesterday about. xAPI is not just pushing data, xAPI is also pulling data and being able to adapt and personalize content as well. All right, so with that said, I'm going to jump into Storyline, and I'm going to show you a feature that was released in Storyline 360 a couple months ago. It's not perfect. I'll let you know that right now, but it's a good start, and it's a start that makes me really excited. So even if you don't actually even add any xAPI statements inside of Storyline, it's actually pretty easy to start tracking an xAPI. If you go into the publish section, and then under this LMS and LRS section, you have a drop-down box to report to an LMS. And there's two different options here. You can send over xAPI tin can API, which is what it used to be called. And then you can send over CMI5, which is a more structured version of xAPI, basically on the verbs that you can use. So you can do that. And if your LMS will basically accept any one of those, you can start tracking xAPI statements without even adding any type of triggers to Storyline. So keep that in mind. I'm going to go into Storm Cloud. This is a test LRS that I use a lot just for testing. And then I'm going to also pull up Watershed, which is another LRS that you can get more data and reports and stuff like that. But I've uploaded this course with just default xAPI. So I didn't add any type of statements whatsoever. I just uploaded it as an xAPI package. Now inside of here, you see this button right here where it says View Registration Statement History. This will actually give all of the xAPI statements that are coming from Storyline by default. So Storyline will track xAPI without you having to even do anything if you upload it to a learning management system that can support it. Now, if you click on launch right here, when you go through the course like normal here, so I'm going to go ahead and click on launch. And then I'm going to go through a couple different pages. I'm going to restart here. I've gone through this a couple times. But if I just click on next and next and go through a couple different pages,
work area cow turkey.
You'll notice really not much different with the learner here, but I'm going to close this out and I'm going to go back into Storm Cloud and I'm going to click on View Registration Statement History. Now, as soon as I do that, it'll show me the list of all the different statements that have been coming in. So you can see right here, Jeff Batts, and I initialized right here Cooking 101. So it grabbed the title of the course for me automatically. Jeff Batt Experienced Introduction. That's the name of my first page. And then also Jeff Batt Left Introduction as well. So every single page, it'll have experienced as when the person started the page, and then it will have left as soon as they left the page as well. Now, if I went to a quiz question, it will also report over quiz data. But this is what really gets me excited is it's tracking a lot more than what we could do with SCORM just out of the box. Now, on top of that, you can also add additional triggers. So I'm going to pull up a Storyline course here. And this one, I started to add some custom triggers. So if you're not familiar with this inside of Storyline, on the new version a couple months ago, you can actually add a trigger. And then in that trigger, you can select the drop-down box and then go down to Send xAPI Statement. Now, in this xAPI statement, it doesn't have all the verbs that are available. It does have a good selection here, but you can select that drop-down box and you can select the verb. If you wanted to use a different verb, you can actually copy from like the verb registry right here. You can copy the verb and you can actually paste it inside of here and you can use whatever verb is inside of that verb registry. So keep that in mind. It is pretty flexible that way. If I select this drop-down box, so that's the verb, the actor, it will actually grab for you automatically when it's in a learning management system. And so that's the verb right here. And then if I click on this plus xAPI, this will show me the statement. Now this is JSON, like Megan was talking about last week, where you can see all of the difference of information inside of this code. And you don't need to know the code. If you wanted to expand upon it, you could do that. You can also insert other additional variables from Storyline. But this is what the statement is, and this is what the information is going to be sent over to the Learning Record Store. I could come in here and just, okay, what do I want to track? Jeff Batt Experienced Cooking 101. And there we go. I can just insert whatever text I want there. And now if it's inside of a learning management system that can handle CMI5 or xAPI data, it will report over automatically. But you may be asking yourself, what if my learning management system doesn't handle xAPI data? Well, or what if I also want to send it over to an external learning record store? Now, Rebecca is going to be talking about actually using a different tool to be able to connect in kind of a legacy LMS and still send over xAPI data. But I wanted to show you at least where you can come into Storyline. If you click on Publish here, you can enable the report to an external LRS here. And if you click on Reporting and Tracking here, you can go into the Learning Record Store, and whatever Learning Record Store that you're using, it will have an endpoint, a key, and a secret. And that's how it basically authenticates you to be able to send over to this learning record store. So going back into my other example here in SCORM Cloud, if I go into my library here, and then I go into the custom triggers, what I'm doing in this course is not only am I tracking it inside of this system here, but I'm also sending over the data to this external learning record store as well. So Watershed in this case. And so I'm going to go into my data and then go into the data search, and this will give me the direct feed of everything that's going on here. And then I'm going to go back into SCORM Cloud and click on Launch. And I'm going to show you some of the custom triggers that I've added. So I'm going to basically just go through a couple different pages and show you that it is sending over to this external learning record store. I'm going to click on Restart here. Just go through a couple pages, exit out of it. And then I'm going to go into Watershed and show you that even though it's inside of SCORM Cloud, it's still sending over information. And you can see right here, it's still sending over that same information to Watershed. So that data is just so much more fluid than SCORM ever could allow it. And that's how we can even pull data in and adapt it and manipulate it how we need to, basically. So I'm going to show you a couple different things here. And one other thing is I want to point out here is notice that in this Jeff Batt experienced introduction, I actually grabbed that how many seconds the learner was spending on that page. So in this case, Jeff Batt experienced introduction for 3.11 seconds. And so even though you're working with these default triggers, what I did is there's a time elapsed variable inside of Storyline. And I took that time elapsed variable and I divided it by 1,000 because right now it just counts in milliseconds. And I divided it by 1,000, and basically that's that I stored it inside of a variable, that information. And then when I send over the custom statements, if I go into that statement here, and then I go into this custom xAPI statement, the only thing I had to do in this trigger was add 4 and then use that variable, which I just selected the drop-down box and found the variable that I inserted. And all I had to do was say time to seconds right there. And so I can add and pass in additional information is basically what I'm trying to tell you here. So you can add on to these statements and track a lot more than what's just there by default. Now, even with some of the learning interactions, I'm going to go into the interactive stuff and then I'll hand it over to Rebecca here soon. But if you click on these tab interactions, instead of just experiencing the page, you can track if they've clicked on different tab buttons. So right here, I send over a statement that the learner interacted with tab 2. I send over a statement here that the learner interacted with tab 3, and so forth. And then even in the dial section here, in this little dial interaction that I have, if you scroll down to the bottom, actually, I think it's up on the top here, but I send an xAPI statement that the learner, what the learner as soon as they're done turning the dial, it's going to send over a statement. And let me click on that just to show you how it's passing in additional information here. But you can see here, the learner answered the dial and then with the variable of that dial. So the variable of that dial is called fire. And all I had to do was go into variables and just insert that fire variable right there. And I was able to pass in that data. So very flexible that way. And you're able to send it over to both a learning management system that can handle xAPI, CMI5, and you're also able to send it over to external. However, if your learning management system cannot handle xAPI data like that automatically, you may have to, meaning that if I go into publish and I have to publish to SCORM 2004, and I still need it to send over to a learning record store, there's a little bit more that you have to do. And that's really where Rebecca is going to take it from here, is if you're working with like a learning management system that doesn't handle that, there's a tool that she's going to cover. And I'll just kind of hand it off to you, Rebecca, for that.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I am going to share my screen. Oops. Hold on just a second. Let me get the right thing up here. Okay. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how I have utilized xAPI statements in a SCORM module that does track the SCORM data to our learning management system, which for us here at Nebraska Medicine, we use Cornerstone. And then it also sends the xAPI statements to our learning record store, which is Watershed, which Jeff did mention a few minutes ago. So what I am mostly utilizing xAPI statements in is our annual compliance training. That lovely module that gets assigned to nearly 10,000 people throughout our organization. And, they have to go through it and attest to having read everything every single year. So in the past, our annual compliance training consisted of about 14 different modules. And these different modules were not something that every single person had to take. It kind of depended on whether or not you were a physician or what location you were in, kind of fed into which content you got. So it was just an assignment nightmare trying to figure out who got assigned what modules. And, there was mistakes made and we'd have to reassign things to people or remove things from their transcript. And it was just a nightmare. So I put all of the content from all of those modules into one storyline module. And then I created content paths depending on job role and location. And then built xAPI statements to track who went down what content path. And there's a few other things that I utilized xAPI for as well, which I'll get to in just a minute. So here's an example of our annual compliance training. All the learners come down this path and then they get to what I call a branching slide that asks them a question. And they'll answer that question by clicking either the yes or the no button. And I have xAPI statements on both of those buttons so that we can track who clicked what button and when they clicked it, what happened afterwards. So our annual compliance training altogether, if you're familiar with Storyline, is about 500 slides. So it's pretty extensive. Not everybody, of course, takes and goes through every single slide. It's based upon, like I said, job role and location. So it was a bit of work for me initially when I put all of those modules together. So here's an example of one of those branching slides. So it basically asks, are you a physician, a resident, or fellow, or advanced practice provider? They'll either say yes or they'll say no. And for example, in this one, if they click the yes button, it takes them to the physician content. And if they say no, it takes them to the content for everybody else that is not a physician. So on each of these buttons, I have some JavaScript code that I add to the button, which is the xAPI statement. And how you utilize that is you use a trigger, like Jeff showed you earlier. Only this time, the action is to execute JavaScript. And the system will execute that JavaScript when the user clicks a particular button. And the buttons I name very specifically so that I know exactly where that button is throughout this module. So for this one, it's the 3.4, are you a physician? Yes button. 3.4 is the slide number. Are you a physician is basically what is being asked. And then this is the yes button. The JavaScript itself, I utilized Megan Torrance's xAPI system to generate the JavaScript code. I am not a coder. I wouldn't not be able to sit down and just type all of this up. So you use that wizard system to type in some information and it spits out the JavaScript code that you can then copy and paste into your trigger. And the verb that I have been using is interacted. So the learner is interacting with a button in this case. Then I just have the name of the button, the description, the type of event is an interaction. And then I just provided some additional information throughout that wizard. And then once you have all of your xAPI statements built onto your buttons, and you've got your JavaScript code that is generated, and you've added that to your trigger, one extra step that you need to take, particularly for us using Cornerstone, Cornerstone doesn't really work well with xAPI statements. So we keep all of the SCORM data in Cornerstone, and then we send our xAPI data to Watershed. So we need to add some JavaScript code on the master slide. For any slide within your course that has xAPI data on it, you need to include this JavaScript code that I'm going to show you in a moment on the master slide. And if you're looking at a module like our annual compliance training that's 500 and some slides long, I made it easy on myself, and I used the exact same master slide for every slide in that course that had an xAPI statement. So I only had to add this code once. So again, it's your execute JavaScript trigger. Only this time it is, you're going to execute the JavaScript when the timeline starts on this object, which is the name of this master slide. It was in the one clean template. And then you've got all of your JavaScript code inside that trigger. And this again was provided by the xAPI system. And it looks a little daunting at first, but I'm going to pick out two little sections that you need to customize in that code that, again, you're able to just copy and paste. The section on the left is where I identify the xAPI statement is being sent to Watershed. Jeff mentioned in the other triggers where you include your endpoint, your secret, and your key. You would also include that in this JavaScript code that goes on this master slide. And I've not included that information on this example because that's unique to Nebraska Medicine. But you would basically include your URL for your learning record store, and then you would enter your endpoint key and secret information here. Then on the right-hand panel, I have the SCORM data, where I have our URL for Cornerstone as well as the name of the module. And that way it knows that all of the SCORM data is sent to or stored in Cornerstone, where we can, of course, pull reports. Okay, so a good example of how I utilized the xAPI statements, in addition to just determining the content pathway. I had a subject matter expert that wanted everybody to read the confidentiality agreement and attest to having read it. And she wanted me to lock that slide down so everybody had to read the contents of that confidentiality agreement. So I started off here with this slide up here on the left, where I have a button that says click to review the confidentiality agreement. And everybody has to click that button because there is no next button on this slide. They have to click that button, which then opens up the second slide layer here on the right that has a scrolling panel containing that confidentiality agreement content. And then they click the red X in the upper right-hand corner to close that. And then they're taken back to the main slide, where they are then given two choices to either say, yes, I will comply, or no, I won't. And what we thought would be interesting is to gauge how much time the person had this slide layer open. We had a small test group that read the contents of that agreement to see on average how long it took them to read the whole thing. And it was on average about 5 to 6 minutes. Because I had xAPI statements on this button and this button, I was able to track the amount of time in between those two button clicks to see the average amount of time that was spent reading that confidentiality agreement. And what we found were non-physicians spent on average 20 seconds on that slide layer, and our physicians spent a little bit more time as 24 seconds. And because we're gathering the actor information, which for us, that's being pulled from Cornerstone, we were able to break down that report even further to see which types of physicians spent how much time. So the people that spent the most amount of time were our physician assistants, and the people in the least amount of time were in ID 906, which off the top of 906 are contractors. So that was really eye-opening to get that information. And so what I did is for this year's iteration, which we're nearing the end of that time period, I went back to that subject matter expert and shared this data with her to say, we're forcing people to open up and read this document, but they're not actually spending the time it would take to fully read it. However, that doesn't mean that people aren't being compliant with that policy. It might be that they've been here for more than a year and they already know what the confidentiality agreement is about. So for this year, I had her add 3 check for understanding questions that follow that slide. And I put xAPI statements on all of the answers to all of those 3 questions. And we're going to be tracking that to see, okay, they're only spending 20 seconds reading that policy, but they're getting all these questions right. So there's really no concern there because they do understand the contents of that policy. So that was pretty neat. And that's really all that I have to show you. I think,
if we don't,
the right thing?
Rebecca, if we have time,
Sure.
someone did ask about Captivate, and I do want to show you.
Absolutely, yes.
I have Captivate pulled up here, so So it's very similar to what Rebecca was talking about, the Captivate process. You do it very, through the JavaScript triggers. And so if you come into actions here, if you wanted it on enter, and then you do the execute JavaScript right here. So similar to what the storyline JavaScript is that Rebecca was talking about. If you're using xAPI or something like that, you would paste in the code here, or you can write out the custom code through a custom JavaScript. So just wanted to at least point that out.
Okay, let's see. What other questions do we have?
Jamie, if there was any other questions that popped up, or are you using Storyline 360 on a M1 Mac or an Intel Mac? Good question. This is an M1 Mac Mini that I'm on right now, and I have Parallels, which I had to install the right version of Windows in order for this to work. And I'm using Storyline on an M1 Mac Mini, basically.
Good question.
Actor ID has been a tricky thing to learn. In your example, is it just because you interacted with the storyline activities in the LMS and you're able to see Jeff Batt? Yeah, that's a good question too. And so if you're using something like the triggers inside of Storyline and you publish it out, you can also publish it out to just an external learning record store. The problem, though, is you don't know who the person is if it's just an external learning record store, because if you publish it out to a learning management system and an external learning record store, what happens is it will grab the person, the actor, from the learning management system, and that's how it passes over who the actor is. I don't have to do that or set that up. If you're using something like xAPI, that could be pulled from a different location. I'm not as familiar with that, but if you're doing something like custom JavaScript, you can grab the actor from a variable inside of Storyline. I've done that as well, where I had the person enter in their name and their email, and I grabbed that. But if you're using the publish to an external learning record store feature now in Storyline, it asks for a variable it asks who the person is through a query string. And so that is a little bit harder to kind of formulate, but I have a template on my website, learningdojo.ninja, where you can download a simple little HTML file that as soon as the course launches, it will ask them their name and their email, and it will pass it through as like a query string. which you can also just grab from. I've in the past have grabbed it from a single sign-on. And so you just have to know how to identify who the person is through a single sign-on and pass that information through a query string as well. Hopefully that helps.
And for us, I just want to jump in there. So Cornerstone for us, all of the learner information is fed into Cornerstone from our HRS system, which is Workday. And then that information is then also passed to Watershed so that it's all connected.
Yeah. You can grab through a variable, like through a custom JavaScript trigger, who the person is. Even through SCORM, you can identify who the person is and store that as the variable.
Yeah.
And this is the one, Brian's question is the one, how do you do this in Captivate? That's where I showed the little custom execute JavaScript trigger inside of Captivate. How do you handle students who leave the training to do something else? That is a good question. Usually, you can I mean, Rebecca, you can answer this for what you guys have done, but you can have like a trigger or in your reports when you're working inside of the learning record store, you can associate like a verb of a completed and only keep track like, oh, anyone who's completed, what is their data? So you kind of filter out anyone who hasn't completed as well. So that would be more in the filtering of the data inside of the learning record store.
I'll grab this question. I don't think they've made any great progress. Cornerstone does have a learning record store, and they will actually be completely transparent when we've talked to them about potentially utilizing their learning record store versus Watershed. And they have been very transparent and said, you know what, Watershed is so far ahead of the game from where we are that you won't be able to do a lot of the things that you're able to do in Watershed in Cornerstone. I do think because of the popularity of xAPI statements and the need for that learning record store, I think they are working on it. But in my opinion, they've got a long way to go.
Is JavaScript Wizard, what JavaScript Wizard and where do you find it? I don't know if they're talking about xAPI on the JavaScript. Is that something?
Yeah, that's probably what they're referring to. Yeah, xAPI is a service that Megan offers through Torrance Learning. It's a subscription service, and you basically enter information into a wizard and you click a submit button and it produces that JavaScript for you that you can just copy and paste into your storyline triggers.
There is also the ability, that is a great resource as well, but there's also the ability to just do this custom. So you can actually use the ADL wrapper, and then there is adl.github.io that allows you to generate the JSON, and then you can trigger that through JavaScript as well. It does take a little bit more code, but you do have that flexibility to be able to just trigger the statements at any point. Are verbs that cannot be found through xAPI features sent via executing JavaScript? Verbs cannot be found. I'm assuming that's if they're not found in that drop-down box. And no, you can actually, when you go into the xAPI JSON inside of Storyline, you can actually just swap out a verb. If you go to the verb registry, you can swap out the verb and the verb ID. So you grab those two things and you can copy and you can paste it into that JSON editor that pops up inside a Storyline. And if you replace it there, you can use any verb that's not part of the drop-down box. Are users, learners informed about their xAPI data being tracked? That's a good question.
Yeah.
Do you guys inform that? Because it's usually like if you're going to go into a learning management system, I'm assuming people know that it's tracking completion and stuff like that. But
yeah, our learners are well aware of tracking using Cornerstone, and since we've been utilizing xAPI, they're well aware that we are tracking data throughout throughout the module. So when they see those branching questions, you know, they're informed to make sure that they're answering those questions to the best of their knowledge, because we are tracking those interactions. So yes, they're aware.
Or maybe you create like an acknowledgement at the beginning of the course or something if you're worried about that.
Yeah, we don't have that built in, but it's certainly something that we could do.
Does Watershed leverage GUID ID as a unique identifier? I don't know, actually. I haven't tried that. Usually I grab the identifier from a variable or from a single sign-on, and then I pass that in through the with the JavaScript when I'm sending it over to Watershed. Now, Watershed will have a feed of people and take those actors, and it will have a feed of people that you can then filter out based on that person and all the statements that are under that person's name. But I don't know about that. I think there's some contacts in Watershed on the xAPI Cohort Slack channel. So maybe if you ask that question, they can answer there. Okay, that's a good question. And it doesn't depend on the LMS, or it could. So when we've done this, we deployed a course that went out. We got about a million statements a year through one course. It was for a volunteer organization, and this volunteer organization, thankfully, had like a single sign-on for the users that are signing in. And when they went to this URL, what it would do is it first of all prompt this single sign-on if they're not already logged in. So that is kind of a redirect code that you had to have, and we had to basically put on that URL that if somebody comes to that URL without being signed in, it will redirect to the single sign-on like Okta. Now, once it's in Okta and the person is behind Okta, it's pretty simple code to be able to identify and grab the person's name and the person's ID, whether that be an ID or a email or something like that. So whoever your single sign-on representative is, you might have to work with them on that JavaScript code. But once I figured that out, and I've helped a couple different organizations with that, but once you figure that out, you can store that inside of the JavaScript, so it will automatically grab that person's name and email and so forth. So it's a couple extra steps to be able to do that, but it is possible, and you probably have to work with your single sign-on rep to do that. If we don't want to track the actor, what's the best way to set that up? I think there was some questions or some chatter about that with Matt and Peter, and you can create like anonymous emails or anonymous users as well. I think that's great, but to me, like xAPI, that's like, I don't know. This is my soapbox for a second. That's no different than just tracking through Google Analytics, in my opinion, because to me, xAPI is all about the learner and what the learner has done, because then you can personalize what the user has, like future content, future learning content. So to me, is like, why wouldn't you want to track it to the specific user? But I know there's, sometimes you want to keep that hidden, but it's just like, I don't know. xAPI, if I'm really not going to track who the person is, I can just do Google Analytics on visits and stuff. But I don't know. That's a personal soapbox issue for me, but it's because I just look at the future. If you can track xAPI, you can then filter and serve up personalized content in the future. So that's one reason why you'd want to track who the person is. You've worked with Watershed as well, Rebecca. I don't know if you want to answer that one.
We use Watershed to pull a lot of things. We still use SCORM to track, learner completion and use Cornerstone for that. We could just simply use Watershed for everything. However, all of our learners are very used to going into Cornerstone to pull completion reports. And all of our learning is launched from there, and they're used to the reports and that sort of thing. So we decided to continue using Cornerstone for those types of things. But all of the slide level activity and how we're analyzing, that information, that is all being tracked in Watershed. And there's some pretty neat reports that we were able to pull with that information. Some other things that we have used are, when you're going through a module and you get to a slide that says, click here for more information, we're tracking how many people are actually doing that. And granted, annual compliance training might not be the best module to put those types of questions in. But then, we can use that data and analyze it to help design modules in the future based on, how those types of things go. So you can use Watershed to pull everything. In a nutshell, yes, you can do that.
Did you evaluate Learning Locker as an LRS? I used Learning Locker for that example that I was talking about that was getting like 1 million statements a year from these volunteers. And I think it worked great. I think as far as most learning record stores can just handle the data input. I think where Learning Locker kind of struggled a little bit more, and we eventually moved to a different learning record store, is it was a little bit more limited on the reports and the data and the connections between the reports. So if you're first starting out, Learning Locker, and you wanted to host it yourself, Learning Locker is a good option. But if you wanted more robust reports, that's where, like Watershed or Veracity or some of these other platforms that create those connections between these different activities and stuff. I think that's really the benefit. If you may eventually move over, and that's a benefit to xAPI, is the xAPI data is much more transferable between systems than it is with SCORM data. So you don't have to go through that whole LMS migration or anything like that. So another question I saw from that just in the chat is Watershed free? There is a free version. The one that I showed you is the free version. You cannot create the custom reports. Those reports are kind of out of the box, which are still nice reports. And so, but it's at least you can get data sent over and test it there. So do we need GDPR or cookie banners for modules that use xAPI? I don't, did you guys have to go through that, Rebecca, at all?
No, we didn't.
Yeah, because it's behind a learning system, we didn't have to do that. So I don't know. Is it just, if you just put the name, the verb name, display value, it will automatically get the ID for the verb? You also, that's a good question. So if you go to the registry, right next to the verb is actually the ID. And when you copy the name of the verb, so that custom verb that you're sending over, you do also have to copy the ID and paste that into the trigger and set a storyline as well. How do you pull the data and compile it for reporting? And that's mostly done, Rebecca, you can talk about your reports, but that's mostly done in the Learning Record Store. I've also built some custom dashboards with that feed, that Learning Record Store feed. So you can build your own dashboards, or you can use Watershed to build custom ones if you want to talk to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different types of reports that we pull from Watershed. We, of course, can pull all of the interactions on a particular person. If there's ever a question that comes up that says, hey, can you verify that, Dr. Smith went down the physician content pathway? We can certainly pull that on a particular learner. We can also pull data from a specific slide. Who clicked this button and who clicked that button. We can analyze, like I showed the example of, how much time in between, different button clicks. You can also use it to gauge, how long somebody is watching a video. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do for in Watershed.
Yeah, and Matt did comment that further session or future sessions will be covering analytics and reporting and other things like that. So stay tuned for those.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, that's a good question. With xAPI, you don't want to track everything. And that's, you can track a lot, but you don't want to track everything. And when I went through the xAPI cohort a couple years ago, really where it came down to is like, okay, what information do we want to know? Do we want to know if the person has visited the page? Do we want to know if they spent how much time they spent on the page? If you're not going to use that data, I mean, there's no reason to track it. So coming up with that plan of how we're going to use that data, are we going to use that data to improve future learning? Are we going to use that data to make or personalize courses in the future? Things like that is what you want to, that's, in my opinion, that's where the instructional design comes in, where you're designing what you want to know later on, basically. So I don't know if there's
Yeah.
anything else you want to add there.
We only track what is necessary. There are certain policies that everyone has to attest to on an annual basis. There's also content that only certain populations have to complete versus others, and we need to be able to pull that data to be able to report back to some of our regulatory agencies like Joint Commission. They need to know if who completed the OR fire safety content. So all of our xAPI data that we're tracking is all very purposeful. It's not just for the sake of doing it. I know the one example I gave to see how much time was spent in between clicks was more to, we used that to identify if there's a need for further education on that. If they're only spending 20 seconds, how do we know if they understand the main components of that policy? So that's why we added, the questions this year. So knowing how much time they're spending, and if they're not getting the questions right, then that opens up a bigger issue where there might be a module needed just specifically for that topic.
And it looks like Matt is saying that there is a future session on data ethics as well as data analytics. So
Matt's on it.
Yes, he is.
All right. Thank you so much. I know we have more questions. They keep rolling in, which is so great to see this engagement. But some of the questions I do see are going to be answered in later sessions. And I want to remind you all, you can also move your conversations over to the Slack channel. If you are missing the link, I think it was dropped in the chat, but also when you register at xapicohort.com, you will get information sent right to your email about that. If you've registered and didn't receive that email, maybe check your junk folder. But Jeff, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. That was great. And we're just going to finish up with a little housekeeping. Normally we try to keep this to an hour, but there's been so much engagement. We are actually approaching the top of the hour. So I'm going to keep rolling, but let Jeff and Rebecca go off stage now. But if you want to keep conversing with other people in the chat, that's fine. If you need to hop, because it is the top of the hour, just want to remind you that you can catch the rest of this session on the replay. So I am going to ask Matt Cleaver to join me here on the stage. And we're going to talk a little bit about some tips for team traction. So first of all, we're going to talk about having your project brief. So let's say you have an idea that you want to work on. What you're definitely going to want to do is set up a Slack channel and post a description in the main channel to invite people. I'll tell you a little bit more about how to do that in just a moment. But let's say you have no idea what you want to work on. You also want to go over to Slack and start searching for the existing channels. See what looks good to you, whether or not you want to join a team. This is a good place to just dig in a little bit deeper. You can join existing teams and contribute some ideas, attend their meetings, maybe actually contribute to the work. And again, joining a channel doesn't commit you to anything. It's just a way for you to get a little more in depth of what people are doing. So successful teams have well enough formed idea. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to have a project brief that is clear about the question or area that you want to explore. You don't have to have all the answers, obviously, But you want to have a compelling idea. And when you have that and you've set up your channel, you want to post that description in the main channel so that people know that you're working on it and that you are setting up a team for it. A successful team also has a Slack channel, which I've mentioned a few times. And you're going to look in the Slack channel for teams, and they're named with hashtag team and then the team name. And you're going to want to post your project brief there and then link people to that channel from the main channel. We also have GitHub, which is useful for file exchange, but it is optional. You don't have to use it. And Matt's going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And then you also want to have good communication. So you want to set up times and means of how you're going to meet with your team. Generally, somebody has to get the ball rolling, but this has just been an incredibly engaged group so far, and we already see this starting. And you're going to want to post weekly status reports in your Slack channel by Wednesday night. That way we have them all ready to go on Thursday so we can do the team updates here in the live web session. And of course, you want to have team members with energy and enthusiasm because that always makes the project go a little better. So when you go over to Slack, on the left-hand side, you will see where it says channels, there's a little plus sign. That's where you're going to click to start searching for existing channels or creating your own. And as you can see, there are a lot of channels that have already been created. So you can skim through those active teams, and you can also skim through teams that are not active and reactivate them. The last one on here is actually not a team. It's xAPI Gnome social media. That's a great place to stay tuned if you're not on social media a lot, but you'd like to know what other people are sharing about. That is a direct feed actually right into the Slack channel. So when you are finding or creating your Slack channel for your team, if you have hashtag team and then the name, that's an active project team that you can join, or that's how you start a new active team. So for example, Team Drag and Drop is a team that's exploring xAPI for drag and drop activity. If you see a Z and then a year and semester, which would be spring or fall, and then team and the team name, that's an archive project team from a previous semester. It's great for research, so you can go through and read, or you can actually restore that channel to pick up where the team left off, and you would just remove that archive naming convention. If you see discuss and then a topic, that's where you're going to have a conversation, but it's not an actual project that anyone is working on. For example, discuss jobs is where you can find and post jobs that are relevant to xAPI. And a few others that are great to bookmark. The main channel is where you can get attention. You can talk to the whole cohort in general, very general messages there. Social is where you can say hi, tell jokes, hang out, post GIFs or GIFs, or debate about if you're a team hard G or team soft G. The resources and recordings channel is exactly what it sounds like. And then the demos and vendors offers is where free stuff is. And Matt, I'm going to let you now talk a little bit about the GitHub pages.
All right, thank you. I just kind of blanked there for a second. So for GitHub, for those who have been in the cohort in seasons past, know that we've used GitHub for repositories for code and files, but also for updates. This time we're going to kind of go a different route with the updates. You can just post your updates in your channel. So for anyone who doesn't use GitHub or doesn't know what GitHub is used for, it's basically started as a code repository. So you would write your code, you could upload it there. It did version control so that you could get a history of your code progress. And then they, over time, have added other features for discussions and project management, things like that, which is kind of how we're using it. So the cohort has an organization that you can join. So the way you join, actually, Jamie, if you want to let me share, I will just kind of quickly jump in there. And I'll just share the group screen. Okay, so you can actually, once this comes up, You can join the cohort organization in GitHub through Slack. So again, this is totally optional. So if your team doesn't have any need for code repositories or file sharing, things like that, or you might have larger files like storyline files or images, things like that, you might use Dropbox or Box or OneDrive, Google Drive. So that might be fine for what you're doing. But a lot of the more technical teams might have a reason to have their code here, and all of it will be public in the cohort. So just make sure that anything you put in there is good for public view and is accessible and Apache licensed for anyone to use. So if you don't want it to be public there or reused and recycled, just make sure you keep that for yourself. But you can kind of see the history of things that other past seasons have done and build on things that others have done there. So so if you want to join through the Slack, the way you do that is you click on this plus on the bottom left. It used to be a little lightning bolt. I changed that recently. You can click that and you can just start typing TeamBot or GitHub, and you'll see this cohort TeamBot there. So when you click on that, it'll open this panel so you can join. And right now, because we're kind of early in the cohort, there aren't any GitHub teams yet because we haven't even described the process. So if I start typing, you'll see there's only one channel there, and it's the Spring channel. And basically there's a parent and child relationship. So every season we create a new parent team that all the other teams fit under. And so once other teams start to form here, you'll see them in the drop down, but you can just join the parent team, and that's fine, and go in and create or join other teams once you're in. And then you can enter your email here, or if you already have a GitHub account, you can enter that here as well, and then it's into the request, and it should automatically send you an email with the invite to the organization. So once you do that, then you can go to this cohort page, which is, I'll just paste it here in the chat. And so you can see here where we have past seasons code. So most of them, we kind of have an informal convention for naming these, but you can name them whatever makes sense for your project. And we have over here the Teams tab, you can see where you can join a team or create a team. So we have each one by their season and year. So spring 2022. So there's a bit of a welcome here where you can kind of read how to create a new team. There's a template to kind of, if you want to set it up, kind of the way the template is based on, and creating a repository and attaching it to your team. All those instructions are here on this welcome page. And as I said, right now there's no teams here, but you can always add a team. Makes sense to name it the same way you have it in Slack. So Jamie's example of team drag and drop, you would just put team drag and drop. Here's all the past ones in there. And so that way, when you're collaborating with your team, you can paste that link to your team in your Slack team, get everybody on the same page, and everybody can join in and make code updates, pull requests, the normal GitHub sort of things that you might do. So if anybody has any questions about that, you can feel free to Slack me. And if you have any issues with this TeamBot, so sometimes it'll go to sleep, so you might have to hit it twice if it happens to be asleep, but I'm also linked here at the bottom if you need to send me a message about that. And if you go to xAPI cohort/teams, you can kind of get a summary and a rundown of basically some of the content that's in GitHub itself. So right now, no teams yet in 2022, but I think, I need to update. I need to update an auth token. So beginning of this year, I had to add a new auth token. So I'll update that. But you can kind of get an idea of just a rundown of past teams and just kind of sift through and see what their updates are. And as I linked before, there's a little bit of a rundown of what I just covered in text form on the info page over on the Cohort website. So if you don't feel like paying attention to what I just said because I jumped through it quickly, you can run back here and see how to get back in. And that is all I got. So back to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Matt. And actually, I think I have a quick visual I can show of the update page. Here. So when you're in looking about a specific team. So, all right, but like Matt said, you can find a lot of information by going to xapicohort.com and checking through those tabs. There's a lot of good information there. You can also always go to the Slack channel, ask for help, look around. And with that being said, we did run a little long today, but thank you all so much for joining us. This was a really great session. Thanks again to Rebecca and Jeff. And we're looking forward to seeing you in the next session. And in the meantime, do make sure that you are registered, because that's also where we send out invites for upcoming events. So get out there and make something cool, and then come back and tell us about it. And I hope you all have a great day.